connect. We have an agenda which was circulated before. I'm going to put this into the chat, and I'm hoping that we can get through much of this fairly quickly so that we have time to hear from you all. So do ask yourself, is there an update on my research? Any new projects, any new papers I'd like to share? I think it would be good to make time for that if we can in the second half. So just so that you're prepared for that. Agenda. In fact, that's not working very well. I'm going to give you a link to the agenda. Here you are, just in case you haven't got that. There we are. And to kick things off, we had a very, very informative, fascinating session that Rosie with Ben Geary and a number of others ran as a follow-on to COP26 and the work that we did at the Pavilion about peatland archaeology and cultural heritage. And that was last week, I think. So I asked Rosie if she might give us a bit of a summary. I'm not sure if you're able to share some of the slides or anything else with the group, but just so that we're aware of that. And I think especially as a research working group, this is something that emerged collaboratively at COP26. And if you can maybe talk about some of the ideas that you have for how you'd like to build on this as a group as well. So Rosie, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Yep,
yes.
Great. So yeah, thank you so much for the time, Mark and Diana. So I'll keep this quite brief, but this is this event that we had last week. The kind of workshop approach is been an ongoing development process between myself and I think Ben Geary, who is in this meeting, he should be here. And also many colleagues across the UK and Ireland and across Northwest Europe around the integration and understanding of peatland cultural heritage in restoration projects. Now, I won't go into too much detail today, but really what we wanted to showcase with the workshop is the practitioners and the policymakers who are involved with on-the-ground practical application of using cultural heritage as part of management and restoration practices across peatland sites, mainly in the UK. And then we had some fantastic examples from the Netherlands from our colleagues over there. I will put a link in the chat to the whole talk so you can see all the speakers. But we had so Kat Hopwood-Lewis from Natural England, who has been really pushing the forefront with the integration and management of how we think about sorry, excuse me, I'm sat in a car park. I do apologise. Sorry. About how things like funding and access to funding can support restoration projects. We're thinking about cultural heritage and how we can support excavation and or not excavation, depending on what is happening at the site, for in line with other aspects of peatland restoration practice. We also heard from some of the academics involved, so Professor Ralph Fife down at Exeter, who's been working down at the Exmoor Myers project for many years, working with the restoration practitioners down there about how we can use cultural heritage data, so the paleoecology, the preserved archaeological remains, to think about past uses of the landscape and how that can inform sort of future practice. And we saw that in action with Emily Stewart-Rayner, who is from the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, so a partnership further north, who are actually putting that into action as we speak. So they are running pilot projects and using and informing on the cultural heritage of these sites with their restoration processes. So as Mark said, this has been a longer than COP26 kind of process. There are people who attended the workshop who've been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years, and we can see the the progress, as for example, in the newest update of the peatland code, we now have the integration of peatland cultural heritage as part of that that code and that broader conversation. And what Ben and I wanted to achieve in bringing this the GPI is setting up a working group who are involved with peatland restoration, but also have that interest and engagement with tangible cultural heritage, so things like archaeology and paleoecology, but also intangible cultural heritage, so thinking about lives and past lives and landscape use of the communities who are associated with peatlands that are being restored. So the group is small at the moment, but really what we want to do is to reach out to everybody within the GPI and get the conversation going, because at the moment it is just Ben and I think people are quite, they've heard our voices quite a lot. So it would be good to hear from other people from across the GPI network and also to bring people in as part of that process. And really what we want to achieve is thinking about how we add that value of cultural heritage within the ecosystem services framework. Cultural heritage and cultural practices already sit as part of that ecosystem services framework. And what we want to really bring to the fore is how to bring equity across that assessment when we're restoring peatland sites. So really that's what I wanted to say today, was to make everybody aware of our workshop, and I will put the link to that online, but also to say that this is not the end. The workshop was just really the beginning, and that we want to open up that conversation and open up those networks. So Ben and I are here, and what we would like to do as part of the sort of next step is to produce something more formal that brings into the current action plans and the future challenges that hold for peatland restoration programs concerning cultural heritage. So that's pretty much it. It's short and sweet today, but I will put the link to the YouTube in the group chat.
That Astrid has done so already. Thank you, Astrid.
Oh, Astrid, thank you very much.
Great. So before we take questions, Ben, is there anything you'd like to add? Otherwise, it will be questions, if I may, for both Rosie and Ben.
No, just a quick, just really to echo what Rosie said, and maybe just to stress the importance of some of this stuff as well. And if I'm going to speak frankly, there's a lot of money going to peatland restoration. A question we're asking a lot of initiatives and groups is how many projects actually involve cultural heritage specialists, whether that's archaeologists or paleoecologists. The answer to that, I think, is not many. I might be wrong, though. It's getting better. Natural England have been fantastic with this, Historic England as well. The IUCN conference that's coming up has a specific cultural heritage kind of focus and theme this year. So I think the other thing that we need to stress is this is pressing as peatland restoration moves ahead. And again, Mark, the inclusion of, as Rosie said, of heritage in the peatland code 2 is really important, but it's very uneven at the moment. So very keen to hear from groups, organisations, individuals about how we can improve that whilst we have the time to do so. I think that's me. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. So questions, Hans, over to you.
Yeah, we have, of course, the enormous challenge to restore, re-wet all degraded peatlands in the coming 30 years if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement. That means that we will have major conflicts, as everybody is aware, because every degradation is a cultural heritage. In fact, they have been done culturally for specific purposes. I have had very bad experiences with restoration destroying medieval peat cutting systems and whatever, or sod cutting destroying Mesolithic sites, etc., etc. So the question is, we are aware that this is coming towards us. Is anybody knowing clear guidelines that we can spread among restoration people, that they are at least aware of the problem and that they know where to look at and what kind of support of archaeologists, cultural historians, etc., they have to seek?
Yeah, great question. Ben, Rosie, what is out there? I mean, I think it's all quite kind of nationally focused, but I'm guessing quite a lot of this could be transferable.
Yeah, I think.
No,
Sorry, Rosie, go on. Carry on.
no, go on. No, go on.
No, I was just going to say really that I think Natural England have led the way on this, and there's now actually a working group as well that involves representatives from Scotland, England, the Republic of Ireland now. I think hopefully Cadw as well. So people like Kat Huppard-Lewis, who's kind of leading that up, Tom Gardner in Scotland, Mary Davis, some of these names may be familiar to some of it. I think they're very much working to try and integrate some of these things into best practice. But Natural England, I say, have really picked up on this, and that's following DEFRA's peat pilot stuff. So it is out there, but I think again, in terms of this working group and the GPI, I think it will be really useful to look at extending this across Europe more and bringing in more parties. As Rosie said, the Netherlands, Roy van Beek and his team are doing a lot of really good stuff, but a lot of that is quite theoretical. And as Roy said in the workshop himself, I think he said, in terms of the Dutch Heritage Agency, they're a bit behind the curve. So that's my thought, Rosie. I don't know if you can add to that.
No, I mean, you pretty much said what I was going to say, but really the point that we want to make moving forward is that as a working group, we want to kind of bring in those national guidances so we can almost sort of a little bit like the GPA that came out last year through the GPI is almost have like a formalized working document that is accessible to people, so that there is guidance out there that, yes, it does come from national sources, but actually in terms of mitigation strategies, we're looking at quite a similar process. I know, so in the comments, so HES have made really, Ben, the Algeo HES guidance from Scotland are really good for looking at established protocols. So as Roxanne is saying about the peatland action group, there's some really good kind of online resources, but as you said, that these are very much at a national level, so it would be really great to sort of bring all that together, and that's part of what we're trying to achieve as part of this cultural heritage working group and research group.
We have at the moment, of course, a global movement for restoration, including peatland restoration. The UN Decade for Restoration is moving things forward, and this would be one of the places where we had to bring these things in. I think then about guidelines where you generalize from national experiences, decisions, support systems, etc., and simply creating awareness of what the risks are. That when you want to restore value, that you do not destroy higher values while you're doing that. That is, of course, the challenge we have.
Mm.
No, absolutely. And I think part of that is not just the risk of loss, but also how we can use the understanding of what archaeology is left in these peatlands, how we can use that to inform restoration practice as well. I think that one of the conversations that gets missed off is we automatically assume that archaeologists want to take these items out of the peatlands because they're of historical value and importance. But actually, and what was so successful, I think, about the workshop that we held last week is that every speaker, we moved away from that narrative and thought about really more about that integration with restoration practices and guidance that is existing and has to develop it. So I think there's a real national kind of approach that we can use, but I think that it can have, a more global application. And I think one of the things that from quite a selfish research kind of perspective is what's really interesting is in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, alongside that, there's a really big push at the moment, particularly through people like the British Council, to think about how, as an SDG on its own, culture and cultural value can actually propagate and support mitigation practice in the climate crisis. So we're really trying to tail off some of those cultural conversations that are happening at the moment, because when we think about cultural heritage in the climate crisis, we often think about, things castles eroding into the sea, for example. But actually, if we bring that into the peatland context, I think we've got a real opportunity to think about how we can not only integrate cultural heritage as part of that ecosystem service framework, but also as supporting mitigation and restoration practice.
Diana, over to you. Intrigued to hear your reactions to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's definitely an opportunity, and Hans mentioned the UN Decade, which is a really important channel. I think that also what I love about the work that we're trying to do here in creating these interdisciplinary relationships is that we have Hans and others that are like global experts on how to write that guidance practice piece. And it really would be good to also have like borrow from some of those guidance pieces so that it can speak the language of maybe those teams that are like, forging ahead and maybe dominating that restoration practice approaches. I think that the really critical thing, and I wanted to echo that because I was also thinking a bit the same thing, is that through the engagement with the environment of people like archaeologists and others, I'm sure that there are lessons that the sort of natural scientists or those that are actually doing practice in the field can learn from. And there's just not this exchange. So really happy and welcoming this emerging working group, as well as noting that we have some more accessible products coming out from the Global Peatlands Assessment. We're going to be having these hotspots or highlight issues. And I think that, the work of that could be captured under this working group would have a place as an issue or a highlight for concern or a case. And we can definitely, as UNEP, leading the Global Peatlands Initiative, but UNEP as one of the co-leaders of the UN Decade, offer that into the UN Decade work stream as well. So very, very supportive, really excited to see the conversation evolving, and also really nice to see that this is a real issue that many people have been facing, but not knowing who is in that field that people need to reach out to. Sometimes it is through creating working groups, informal or formal otherwise, and even looking at the national level, you create these pockets of experts that can link outside of the regular groups. So really looking forward to seeing and supporting how this evolves. Thanks.
Right. So maybe take a few more questions or comments and then come back to Rosie, because I'd like to, if you can think also, Rosie, just in terms of next steps, how to make this concrete, how we can help as a group and turn this into something that can be used internationally. So if I may, if you can just hold on to your, maybe you haven't got a pen and paper there, Rosie, maybe, but if you just hold on, we'll just get a few more thoughts just so we keep hold of the time. Roxanne, over to you.
I just wanted to come back on what Hans was saying earlier. I think here we've identified one of the challenges in terms of peatland restoration delivery, in terms of how do you transition from the traditional to the modern? How do we take into account these multi-generational practices that have been taking place that are very much part of the cultural essence of people here? For example, peat cutting and association with crofting. So they're aware that this practice will have to disappear and that some areas will have to be restored, but they need help in understanding how they can maintain that heritage and how these practices can be kept alive in a different way, whether it's through, museum recordings, whatever. But it's how do you make that transition? And I think that's going to be also very important in a lot of the kind of mountain peatland restoration setting, where traditionally a lot of the degradation has come from grazing. And the kind of those traditional practices that have again been kind of handed down from generations ago. And how do you integrate that traditional knowledge, cultural practices with the needs for restoration, as opposed to how do you make sure that restoration preserve, I think there's a slight nuance in that maybe I can see is coming our way and people are aware of. But we don't really have a resolution for it just now. So it's not so much a question as a comment, maybe something to think about.
Fascinating. So intrigued to get Rosie's perspectives on this. If I can just take Eric and Ben's thoughts, and then hand over to Rosie to close, if that's okay. Eric.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, that's a very interesting opportunity, I think, to develop this the relation between cultural heritage and peatland. And we have a very interesting experience related to pastoralist management of peatlands in mountain areas. And in fact, there is a world network of mountain biosphere reserves that is part of UNESCO that could be interested on that, and also the Mountain Partnership at FAO. So I see some opportunities to join forces with different organizations, and also in the framework of the International Year of Camelids, and the International Years of Rangelands and Pastoralists. So that will be a good opportunity to raise this issue that is very interesting. In fact, mountain peatlands is something that I want to promote in this group, and to see if someone is also interested on that, especially in the relation between animals and peatlands management. Thanks.
Yeah, so much fertile ground for discussion. Love it. Ben, over to you.
Actually, sorry, I'm just following up Eric's comments. Strangely enough, Eric, we're working with an environmental historian, as well as other archaeologists and ecologists, on a project in southwest Scotland looking at kind of later Holocene landscapes, grazing, human activity, peatland spread. So we're doing kind of stuff on that, and there's loads of potential for it. Something that'd be really nice to look into. So happy to kind of talk off thread about that. And really, just 2 quick points to follow up what was said earlier. I think the language thing is key. Diana mentioned that, and it came up in the original workshop, that we often talk slightly different languages when we talk about archaeology or restoration, and Kat made that point. So we need to find better ways to communicate, and that's related, I think, conceptually to the sense that sometimes archaeology gets in the way of stuff, and there's reasons for that. But I think we need to move beyond that and discuss again. I think Roxanne said this: the fact that archaeology and heritage bridges all these things, and we need to bring that into debate. And I think sorry to finish and hand back to Rosie. Ecosystem services allows us to do that, and quite often, we know there's always trade-offs, things get pushed off the end. I think we need to bring things back in and go, okay, well, what are we prioritizing, what are we losing? And to come back to my earlier point, more cultural heritage people need to be involved in peatland programs, and that's a challenge for all of us trying to communicate that. And sorry, I'll shut up now, but thanks everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to do this and talk about it, so thanks.
Yeah, brilliant. So Rosie, lots to respond to, and if you can conclude with some next steps as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so actually Ben took every single word straight out of my mouth. So thank you very much, Benjamin.
Sorry.
But in terms of just next steps, I think what's really key is that there are a few things that I would like to achieve over the next, I suppose, 12 months as we sort of develop. It'd be interesting to see what happens. I'm not going to COP this year, but it'd be interesting to see what comes out of COP following the Climate Heritage Network presence that was at COP27 last year. So in terms of what I'd like to see with this working group is getting people around the table. So finding out networks, getting networks together, and reaching out beyond sort of the UK, Ireland, Northwest Europe kind of group that we have at the moment, and bringing in other practitioners from across the kind of peatland restoration GPI working group, and thinking about that relationship as Roxanne pointed out, between sort of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And I think what would be good is if we got together and sat down and sort of discussed at a sort of national and global level the way in which, or the kind of state in which cultural heritage has been integrated at different kind of scales, at restoration scales. And finally, one of the things that I would be most kind of keen to put forward is to develop as Diana mentioned, kind of an output, like a formalized output that bridges that key language gap between kind of cultural heritage, how we talk about cultural heritage, and the ecosystem services framework and restoration practice. And I think that would be really the thing that would really get cultural heritage back into that conversation, because we're really struggling at the moment to bridge that gap. And I think that by having an interdisciplinary unified front where we have a language that we all understand, but from different perspectives in the restoration process, then I think that that would give cultural heritage a better standing in the restoration process. So yeah, it was really great to talk to you all. It'd be great to talk further, and hopefully through the GPI kind of networks, get something like that off the ground. So thank you very much, everyone. It was great to talk.
And thank you for joining on the move. That's obviously well managed. So Hans, a brief comment in a moment, but Rosie, let's take the conversation offline in terms of how to resource this. So if anyone has any ideas, that would be great. I've got a few thoughts of my own, and I'll maybe talk to you about that, Rosie. But the key thing is let's get some resourcing. Let's actually make this happen. So great, Hans, briefly, if that's okay, so we need to move on.
Yeah, a short remark, because restoration is about restoring services or values, and services are very wide, and values also. We are actually dealing about the valuation of values, of different values, how you have to weight them against each other. And therefore, thereby we have, of course, to consider that historical values, heritage values, are one-off values. You cannot restore them in principle. You can, of course, imitate them, but that is the big advantage or the big asset of historical values, this one-off thing. You cannot restore them. If you lose them, they are lost forever. So that is important in your valuation of these things. And a valuation of things, tens of years ago, I made a valuation system where we, for restoration, where we compared everything. For example, cultural values, historical values, birds, vegetation, etc., to find a common valuation framework where you can compare all these things. And that has to do with rarity, and that has to do with reversibility. And these things can be combined, and I have the tendency of giving priority to time over space. So reversibility or age, etc., over rarity in space. So these are considerations that you have to address if you want to make guidelines, what you gain and what you lose.
Yeah, very good point.
Looks like you're joining the working group, Hans. I've just nominated.
Welcome.
Thanks.
You're more than welcome.
Okay, great. Let's
your time.
Yeah, brilliant. So let's move on. So I'll just cover a couple of brief ones. I was hoping that we'd actually be sharing the paper with you at this point. It will be finished by the end of next month. So not quite there yet, but we've spoken to you about this for a while now. So this is a paper which is effectively an impact evaluation of the Peatland Pavilion. So did it actually make a difference? Was it worth it? That's the question. My assessment of this is not a question that people ask, which is a bit strange given the huge amount of expense and emissions that we make flying into these climate conferences and running side events and the like. What is the point? Does it actually work? And essentially, this is the paper. It's going to be submitted to Myers and Pete. And that's our abstract, and we have evidence for three impacts which are both significant and far-reaching. Of course, there were many other impacts, but there wasn't evidence for them all. The first is around bringing together governments across Europe to coordinate policy and action for peatland protection and management through the European Peatlands Initiative, and the role that the Pavilion played in catalysing that. The second one is the one that we've just been talking about, changes in restoration practices and policy to preserve cultural heritage. At this point, that's a UK impact, but as we've just said, we're wanting to build on that to make that hopefully a more international impact. And then finally, providing a platform for knowledge exchange that actually led just to a bunch of new ideas, but to some actual new policy commitments and initiatives in the Baltic states, Uganda, Scotland, and Chile. So much more in the paper, and I'll share the actual paper with you once it's finished by our next meeting. Sorry, it's taking a bit longer than expected, but I thought I'd share at least where we're at, given that that was on the agenda. Not quite such good news is Lydia, thank you. Lydia Cole led a proposal into the British Academy and Leverhulme for this idea that we pitched a couple of meetings ago for evidence synthesis around policy relevant peatland questions internationally. We got knocked back from that. We identified another target and we got knocked back from that as well. And so we're back to the drawing board again. My experience with funding is you keep trying and eventually you will get there. I think this is a good idea. It's about finding the right target. So although we don't have funding to do that yet, the goal was for that to effectively be the successor to the training program that we ran as a working group. And my hope is that that still does happen. But if you have any ideas for additional targets for us to put that to, please let us know, and ideally ones that would allow us to do something international. That's part of the challenge, I think, with this. So the main discussion points we'll move to next. Before I do that, any questions or comments on those two updates? Especially if you have ideas for funding, put them in the chat. Great. Great. Thank you very much indeed. Good idea, Izzy Cheng. And for all the rest of us, potentially there are things we may want to submit there. Great. So Diana, do you want to lead off on the main discussion point, or would you like me to do this?
Thanks so much, Mark. I don't know why I'm just hoping that you can hear me. My internet's gone a bit glitchy. But we wanted to talk to a little bit wider to the group again, because we are hearing a lot of discussions and webinars and exchanges increasing, with a wider audience, but also replicating or, many conversations happening, but not necessarily all the same people. But we wanted to also look at the discussion around the carbon markets, looking at, how could we, as the Global Peatlands Initiative and or the research community, share more direction or context and content to guide the emergence of these growing sort of carbon markets, and what's the opinions from the community on where this is placed. So a little bit of that is about investment opportunities, some businesses looking for social, corporate social responsibility stuff, or more like ESG stuff, and how do we as a community want to see some of the formalization of any sort of carbon market to consider peatlands? Should it be considering peatlands specifically, or is the evolution of a carbon market as it stands on a good pathway that's going to support these ecosystems? That's sort of the conversation I wanted to have with those that are already involved in it, but also, what is missing out there in the discussions.
Right. And in the agenda, just a few kind of concrete ideas of people who've approached who would like to potentially do things. They would have different kind of audiences, but yeah, I guess there is that more fundamental question first of, is this something we want to get involved with? That debate is out there, it's raging. Do we want to kind of have a say, facilitate critical debate? It doesn't mean that we need to have any particular position. We can all have different ideas about this, but is that something that we can make a contribution to? What are people's thoughts? So if I can kick things off, I've just been having a conversation with someone in this very room from the Scottish Wildlife Trusts about the potential to kind of build some kind of more public-facing campaigns in this area, the reasoning behind this is that there's a growing amount of a very negative, skeptical media coverage. In the Guardian newspaper, for example, they're kind of running a campaign effectively trying to discredit peatland as well as any other kind of carbon market. And to an extent, there's an entirely fair point here. We should be reducing emissions. We shouldn't just be continuing as usual and greenwashing our way out of this through carbon offsetting. But I think there's a real danger that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And in my experience, certainly engaging with some of the journalism that I've seen in the Guardian newspaper, but also with some of the activists in this space, is that they're not actually very well informed about the nature of the risks and what can be done to responsibly scale these markets, to regulate and to ensure that they don't just run amok. And my sense is that there is room for taxation, for more public funding, and there is room for markets, and there's room to combine these, and potentially you get win-wins. And so is there a role to actually try and influence that public debate and try and create a bit more nuance and bring a bit more evidence into that space? Hans.
It's a very multifaceted subject, of course, what you are addressing now, the entire carbon markets. I have been involved myself for 15 years already in this business. For example, we made the first adaptation of the verified carbon standard, Vera, for including peatland restoration. We have included peatlands under the Kyoto Protocol, peatland, so wetland drainage and rewetting, and various other things. We have created our own standards, etc. There are several considerations. First, that restoration is needed and that it costs money. And the question is whether this money can come from public funds. The expectation is that public funds will not be sufficient to cover the stuff and that additional funds are needed. And that is actually the background for the voluntary carbon market. The voluntary carbon market was in the past based on offsetting. So that you say, okay, we try to compensate the unavoidable emissions from a company or a school or a city or a country by buying offsets by, for example, rewetting peatlands somewhere else, like Heathrow has been doing by buying carbon credits from Scotland, or Shell has been doing by buying carbon credits from Kalimantan. So this is actually the Paris Agreement, and specifically the IPCC 1.5 degree report, has changed the field considerably. Because according to IPCC 2018, if you want to reach the Paris goals, we have to reach net carbon neutrality. That means simply that until 2050, you can still use avoidance offsets for exchanging between sectors that are faster and slower, but that after 2050, avoidance offsets will not be possible anymore because they are not additional anymore. So we are then talking only about removal offsets. When we look at peatlands, it is very clear that the avoidance offsets is the big bulk. The removal of a living peatland is per hectare 5 times less or even more than the emission from a degraded peatland per hectare per year. So the big gain from restoration is in avoidance, avoiding emissions. There is a big difference between avoidance credits and removal credits with respect to the permanence. Because avoided emission is always permanent, even when you now rewet a peatland and reduce your emissions, but you drain it again after 10 years, the avoided emissions during these 10 years are permanent. Not on in the time frame of eternity, But in the timeframes where we are talking about, decades until centuries, you will not use this up anymore. This in contrast to removals, because removals, if you turn them back, then the carbon that it has been sequestered from the atmosphere goes back into the atmosphere. So this is an important difference. The removals require, therefore, much stronger criteria to guarantee their permanence. Yeah. The removals are furthermore so small that they are much more difficult to monitor, to measure, and to quantify as a basis of monetarization and commodification. That is something that you have to keep in mind. So I think that it is certainly in the coming decades necessary to use the voluntary markets as a platform to attracting money for scaling up and boosting peatland restoration. The focus should be on avoidance. Removals need much more guarantees and much more discussion how you monitor and measure, etc. These things, and they will always be much smaller in volume. But as removals will always be necessary in the end to compensate for unavoidable emissions, you will need them. And the removals, because we do not manage to come up with removals, it is a little bit a hype of nature-based solutions. The nature-based solutions are not going to bring somewhere. I was incredibly shocked by the statement of Werner Kurtz last week on the webinar of the Academy of Sciences of the US about the thing of Canada. Canada has given up the idea that Canadian forest will be a sink. If Canada gives up this idea, where are the sinks where we are talking about? The sinks that we will be having will be extremely expensive. So that is important to keep in mind. But with respect to sinks, these sinks must be caused by restored peatlands, because the sink of existing living peatlands is not additional. You cannot claim them because they are already there. And these are some of the complexities of this entire carbon issue. I will stop here because otherwise I talk too much.
Yeah, and this question of avoided emissions versus removals is particularly controversial, given that the Science-Based Targets Initiative that many companies are using to set their net zero targets has basically said that removals only are allowed. There is some work going on via the Climate Kick program to try and lobby SBTI on that position, where others, including myself, have failed. Who knows if that will succeed? But controversial, absolutely. Eric, over to you. Eric, you're on mute, I think. Oh no, I just can't hear you. Can you look at your mic? Or you might need to write your comment in the chat. Sorry, Eric. While Eric is attempting to write, apologies. Other reactions to this, and I'd like to try and make this a bit more practical. What do we think about as a research working group? We've always done trainings, webinars, which have been more internally facing or facing the policy community, decision makers of various types, practitioners, for example, with the cultural heritage stuff. But something more public facing is something that we've not done before. And effectively, this is a proposal for more public engagement from us as a group, trying to bring some of these nuances out into these increasingly public debates. Do people think that's the kind of thing that we should be engaging in? Do we want to be doing that? Are there people who would like to kind of voice concern? Maybe we're spreading ourselves too thinly. Yeah, what are your reactions to the idea that we start engaging like this? Yeah, Diana.
Thanks. I think it's really, interesting and important for us to look at the elements which are missing across the discussion. What is missing in the approach the metrics, the calculations, and how as a community could we think of filling some of those gaps, if there are any gaps at all. But I think at the moment, you know, a conversation within the wider community, you know, how can the research community help to unlock, advance, inform some of the, you know, emerging approaches in different countries. And I think, you know, having even, you know, within UNEP, we have regular discussions, and we usually have these brown bag lunches where, you know, we reach out across the entire organization and someone talks about carbon markets, about what are those challenging situations, because in the wider UN Environment Program, we're all being confronted with those. I agree that it's not our place, nor the right time to create any position. But I do think that, you know, having a wider group trying to tackle the problem and also inform the problem is really important. We started that engagement with the business community, and, you know, how do we unlock investment for peatlands with a group that was in London, also contributed to the discussion that the Great North Bog, how they have managed to learn and unlock. We did the economics of peatlands piece, which of course looks at this, at the market, as all these other mechanisms that can combine to, you know, be in front. But I do think, you know, for places and for the uniqueness of peatlands, there should be some sort of communication from the science community of what is the risk, what is the opportunity, but also what is the uniqueness of investing in peatlands. Personally, that's what I think would be an interesting position paper. Thanks.
Interesting. So it's not about necessarily coming up with a position, but having that kind of critical assessment of those risks, those opportunities, and so, yeah, a potential to inform debate. Lydia, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I agree with Diana. Just thinking about some work that I've been doing in the Outer Hebrides in Lewis, looking at crofting communities and maybe some overlap with Roxanne's work. And something like the peatland code isn't yet working there. It's causing many problems. So I wondered whether a case study approach and bringing together, for example, I could present that work, and then I know Fenland Soil are having some conversations about what's going on in East Anglia and the Cambridgeshire Fens, etc., in that area. So perhaps bringing together a few people who really know about specific case studies, what is working, what isn't working, and having a bit of a symposium, and perhaps inviting, maybe not on the first day, maybe a second day, inviting somebody from The Guardian and various other outlets that could understand, or as Diana said, perhaps doing a summary for the press after that, so that it's both informative for us as a research community to understand where the gaps are. And Mark, I think you're already doing research on where the peatland code isn't working. I think you said in a previous meeting. But there seems to be such nuance that really needs to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about how to proceed with carbon markets associated with peatland restoration. Yeah.
Great, and I do like the idea of inviting press along and/or creating summaries from that, but being able to do something much more in depth. Even having a journalist chairing something like that can be quite a nice way of doing that. We're running out of time, so Ben, if you can make your comment and any other comments on this in the chat, and then we'll sum up. Ben, I think. Oh, are you going to?
Oh, sorry, Mark. Sorry, yeah, just very quickly. The demise of The Guardian is very sad. I don't know what's happened to journalism with that paper, but anyway, I think what unites this, and I probably would say this, said it already, and go back to Lydia's comments, is when we talk about carbon markets, and I talked about this at the IECN at one of the meetings a few years ago, is a lot of people get switched off by carbon, and I find it with the students here. But even the idea of carbon markets, I think, and for me, kind of what bridges this, and again, Lydia's point, is the cultural side of all this. This kind of unites and brings us all together. And I think there's different angles we can consider in there. And I've seen this happen at other meetings and conferences where people talk about carbon, and it's difficult to get your head around. It's a difficult sell sometimes. I think it is. So I do wonder whether there's other ways into this, and that might relate to what we talked about earlier as well, of how we talk about peatlands in different ways and the benefits they provide. So that's my tuppence.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Thank you, Inabushi. Nice example. Rosie also agreeing, engaging specific publications, maybe not The Guardian, and seeing where that goes. We do have a very specific approach from one of the Britain's Royal Societies that will probably be more UK focused, but we can talk about that being more international, perhaps. So given the reaction, I think I'm going to suggest that we explore that and see where that goes. And depending on how that goes, then that's something we might then want to replicate and try and do a series of more kind of public dialogues and engaging with journalists from not just Britain, but from other countries. So I'll make that as an action if that's okay with anyone. But if anyone really disagrees, then we've got a little bit of time, not as much as I'd hoped. So I said it may be good to put some stuff into the chat. That's always a good way of doing this in parallel and getting lots of stuff in. But at the same time, while we're doing that, if anyone would like to raise hand and speak to what they've been up to, it would be lovely to hear what you're doing at the moment. So papers, projects, or just, here's something really interesting that's happening at the moment in my peatland research. Over to you. Diana.
Thanks. And maybe I'll just speak to Eric's comment about interested in doing mountain peatlands work. It's certainly something that UNEP has actually done a proposal for the Andes peatlands in Peru through an ICI proposal, and we also did one that looked at the Central Asian countries as well. So we can be in touch, Eric, to talk about that, how we could refine and come together for a renewed proposal, I think, on that. Good news that I've been asked from the International Climate Initiative to extend Global Peatlands Initiative project for another 2 years, and I'm at the moment putting together a proposal which includes some ongoing support to this community, as well as to scaling up the Global Peatlands assessment impact and outreach by, doing a series of webinars, but also looking at specifically expanding the partnership with support to a couple more countries. So happy to share that once I've sort of put this together. It's kind of a rush job, but it is going to be helping us to continue to support this community as well as the engagement with policy. Thanks so much.
Thank you for advocating for us and supporting this. It's great. Really appreciate that, and good luck. Also, good luck, Roxanne. Very exciting to hear that. Wow. But how long until you know?
It's quite a long process. So we've been working on this. The first mention of that was in 1988. Could you believe it? But the meeting is usually in July. So I think if everything goes to plan in terms of the process that the IUCN and UN have to follow, that should be the outcome should be known in July next year. But at the moment, we've done everything that we could, and we'll just have to wait and see.
Wow. Excellent. Eric, is your microphone working now? Oh, it's not. I'm so sorry to tell you that, Eric. Nightmare. In the meantime, I've just put a paper that I've got under review at the moment. It's not related to peatlands, but it's part of a broader initiative to try and decolonize language in research. And so I think a lot of us work with stakeholders, and maybe we want to think about how we talk about our supposed stakeholders. Yes, we can hear you, Eric. Over to you.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying. Yeah, sorry. Happy to collaborate in the development of, for example, something like related to mountain peatlands. Use the global peatland assessment to have a specific document related to the mountain peatlands, and related to what you say about carbon credits. I think that now with the Article 6, the markets are already open. So the only thing that we can do is just to help in the moderation of this kind of carbon markets. And for example, we have related to peatlands some methodologies, specific peatlands related to tropical peatlands, and even in mountain peatlands, we have specific methodologies for carbon credits related to páramos, but not for bofedales in the central Andes. So there is a need, and we have also now this consultancy that Astrid shared with us related to Vera. No, they are including mountain peatlands. So there are many things moving on. And in this sense, as a group, I think we have to be aware and contribute and try to moderate this situation, no, to have clear rules and to make, in this sense, the awareness of the importance of some peatlands.
Yes.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And if you can send us any more information or any links in the chat as well, that would be great. So one final comment, and then Diana, if you can close. So Zichang, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to make a quick comment, to follow up on the point made by Erica and Diana about the mountain peatland. And we are in the process to apply for international cooperation project to work on mountain peatland in Andes and Tibetan Plateau, southern east edge of the Tibetan Plateau, kind of comparative study, focusing on carbon sink capacity of peatland, and also quantify the kind of relative contribution of climate change and human influence on the peatland stability, hydrology, vegetation, and carbon accumulation stability. And not really related to carbon credit or restoration, but indeed we realize the kind of importance for mountain peatland and along the line for kind of carbon storage. And I actually contacted Diana about support that particular project. Try to get a kind of international partner from UNEP, and together with National Natural Science Foundation of China. So they put together, and the whole kind of call for proposal relate to the global south. The global south environment related to the sustainable UN Sustainable Development Goal. So the 17 goal. I think recently had a lot of focus on that. So yeah, this point I want to make, mountain peatland, kind of not related to a carbon credit or restoration or, historical heritage, but there's some component, obviously, human impact component into it, and the relative role of human impact and climate change. And yeah, another quick comment is made in the chat.
Really sorry, we are out of time. It is 1 minute.
Okay, yeah.
We will need to go to meetings. I'm so sorry. It sounds like
that's
Eric,
okay. Yeah.
Hans also like to talk, so please connect with each other after today. And Diana, if you can close now for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about connecting these things together. GPI and the team here at UNEP, which is small, but we're going to be growing again, is available to make these connections and to make sure that these are done in collaboration and not in competition. So indeed, building from previous lessons from previous approaches. Hans has a wealth of knowledge as well, sharing here, as well as everyone on this call, as well as the wider community. So please do share. I think that this, you know, the emerging funding opportunities, there's so much work to do. If we collaborate, we can refine and also then scale up. And happy to take the journey with Ben, Rosie, and others for how do we really tackle the missing link to cultural heritage and the other disciplines that should also be very involved in developing our approach to peatlands restoration and conservation. It's not only about the restoration action, but really about the protection of peatlands and what strategy are we going to use as a science community, as a practice community to also influence that. We've got 80 plus 82, 88% of peatlands that are healthy. So we need a strategy to make sure that those have their role in the landscape. Thank you so much, everyone, for the time. Please do share on the Slack channel. Also, if you're not using Slack, you can share them, and we'll share them on an email and try to connect up as many people as we can. But thanks so much for being here with us. Thank you to my co-chair, Mark, as well as Astrid for coordinating the meeting. Have a great day wherever you may be, starting your day or finishing it off.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.